Harper was only 26 years old, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone twice her age. As a single mother working long, grueling shifts at a local diner, buying a house felt like an unattainable American dream. So, when she found the beautiful, two-story craftsman home on the edge of town for a price that seemed too good to be true, she didn't ask questions. She signed the papers, packed up their meager belongings, and moved in with her 4-year-old son Leo. Leo was her absolute world. He was a sweet, chubby, cheeked boy who loved Paw Patrol and would cry if he accidentally stepped on a beetle. For the first week, the house felt like a sanctuary, but houses with dark pasts have a way of keeping secrets until the keys are handed over. For Harper, the dream house was about to transform into a living, breathing nightmare. The honeymoon phase ended abruptly on their 10th night in the house. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. when Harper woke up to a sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was a whistle. It wasn't the chaotic whistle of the wind through a window pane. It was a deliberate, rhythmic, 7-note melody. High, pitched and agonizingly slow, it echoed directly through the HVAC vents, sounding as if someone was standing right beneath her bedroom floorboards, just the old pipes. Harper muttered to herself, clutching her blanket to her chin. It's just an old house settling. But deep down, she knew pipes didn't carry a tune. The next night, the whistling returned, but this time, it wasn't alone. Just as the melody faded, a violent bam shook the entire house. The sound was so concussive that Harper felt the floorboards vibrate beneath her mattress. It sounded like a heavy sledgehammer slamming against wood. Panicked, thinking someone had broken in, Harper grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and crept downstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The front door was locked and bolted. The windows were secure. But as she passed the kitchen, she froze. The heavy wooden door leading down to the pitch black basement began to rattle violently on its hinges. Then, with a deafening crash, it slammed shut right before her eyes. The force was so immense that the drywall around the frame cracked, showering the linoleum floor with white dust. There was no draft. There was no rational explanation. There was only a suffocating, icy silence. By the third week, the unseen entity grew tired of just making noise. It wanted to show its strength. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Harper was sitting at the dining table, trying to balance her checkbook, while Leo played quietly with his wooden blocks on the rug nearby. To soothe her frayed nerves, Harper had lit a few large, heavy-scented candles in thick glass jars. Suddenly, the ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The air became so bitter that Harper could see the faint mist of her own breath. Before she could even process the sudden chill, a violent voice ripped through the room. One of the heavy glass candle jars lifted off the table, suspended in mid-air for a fraction of a second, and was then hurled violently across the room. It shattered against the far wall with a terrifying explosion of glass and hot, flying wax. Harper screamed, ducking her head. But when she looked over at her son, her blood ran cold. Leo hadn't flinched. He hadn't cried. He just sat on the floor, staring blankly at the wall where the glass had shattered. His eyes were wide, vacant, and completely hollow. "Leo, oh my God, Leo, are you okay?" Harper scrambled across the floor, pulling him tightly into her lap, checking him for cuts. Leo slowly turned his head to look at her. His face was a mask of chilling indifference. "He's mad because you're making too much noise, Mommy," Leo whispered, his voice completely devoid of his usual childlike innocence. Who is mad, sweetie?" Harper's voice trembled. "My big brother," Leo replied matter-of-factly, pointing a small finger toward the dark corner of the dining room. "He lives in the walls. He says this used to be his bedroom before he went into the ground." Harper tried desperately to rationalize it. She spent hours on her phone, scrolling through parenting forums, convincing herself that Leo was just inventing an imaginary friend to cope with the stress of the move. But an imaginary friend doesn't change a child's fundamental soul. Leo, who used to be the sweetest boy in the world, began to change rapidly. He stopped playing with his toys. Instead, he would sit for hours facing the corners of rooms, "I'll be mum," muttering words Harper couldn't quite make out, nodding his head as if listening to someone else speak. Then came the cruelty. A few days later, Harper looked out the kitchen window and felt her stomach violently drop. Leo was standing in the backyard by her garden. He was systematically pulling the petals off her flowers, crushing them in his dirt-stained hands. But that wasn't what made Harper's heart stop. At his feet lay a small, lifeless blue jay. Its wings were bent at unnatural angles. Leo was staring down at the dead bird, his face twisted into a dark, vacant expression. Harper rushed outside, tears stinging her eyes. She grabbed his small wrists. "Leo, what did you do? Did you hurt this poor bird?" Leo didn't look guilty. He just looked exhausted. Deep, dark purple circles had formed under his 4-year-old eyes, making him look ghostly. "I didn't want to, Mommy," he whimpered, his voice cracking slightly. "But the brother said I had to practice. He said if I don't practice on the little things, I won't be strong enough for the big thing." "What big thing, Leo?" Harper asked, a wave of pure, unadulterated dread washing over her body. Leo just stared through her, his lips sealing into a tight, grim line. He wouldn't say another word. The horror reached its absolute peak on a stormy Friday night. The mysterious whistling downstairs had morphed into a horrifying chorus of frantic, heavy breathing that echoed through the vents. The doors downstairs were rattling so fiercely it sounded like an earthquake was localized entirely within their home. Terrified for their lives, Harper barricaded herself and Leo inside the master bedroom, pushing a heavy wooden dresser against the door. She held Leo tightly against her chest, rocking him as the house groaned and shook around them. Somewhere around 200 a.m., the chaos abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was heavy, oppressive, and deafening. Exhaustion finally won, and Harper's eyes drifted shut for what felt like only a few seconds. When she woke up, her arms were empty. "Leo," she panicked. The bedroom door was still locked, the heavy dresser unmoved, but her son was gone. Then she heard a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the attached master bathroom. Harper crept out of bed, her bare feet pressing against the freezing floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly pushed the bathroom door open. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the periodic, stark flashes of lightning from the window. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the cold tile floor. In his small, trembling hands, he held Harper's heavy, razor-sharp silver fabric shears, the ones she kept hidden on the top shelf of the closet, completely out of a 4-year-old's reach. He was staring directly into the dark corner of the shower, nodding slowly. "Leo." Harper's voice was a breathless, terrified gasp. "Baby, please put the scissors down. Come to Mommy." Leo slowly rotated his head. The boy looking back at her wasn't her son anymore. His eyes were cold, ancient, and filled with a terrifying malice. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but his expression remained deadpan. "He's standing right behind you now?" Mommy, Leo whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "My big brother. He's been crying all night. He's so lonely." Harper froze. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave her baby. "Leo, please. Drop the scissors." Leo slowly stood up, raising the heavy, sharp metal blades, pointing them directly at Harper's chest. "I can't, Mommy." Leo sobbed, though his grip on the metal handles never wavered. "He told me what I have to do now. He said if I want the whistling to stop, I have to use these to cut your throat." He wants me to kill you so we can all be a family forever. Have you ever seen something so unnatural, so fundamentally wrong, that your brain simply refused to process it? You stand there, frozen, while your mind frantically flips through its filing cabinets, desperately trying to categorize the horror in front of you as a trick of the light, a shadow, or a dream. But deep down, in the most primal part of your gut, you know it's real. I want to tell you a story. It's not about monsters hiding under the bed or ghosts rattling chains in a graveyard. It's about the things that seep into the wood of a home, the things that quietly watch us in the dark. And it begins in an old, rotting wooden apartment building on the edge of the city. I used to live in a place I nicknamed the Roost. It was a 3-story, all-wood apartment building that looked like it had been built a century ago and forgotten shortly after. The wood was perpetually damp, warped by decades of harsh rain and neglect. Every step you took in that building echoed with a sickly creak. The hallways were narrow, lit by flickering, jaundiced yellow bulbs that always seemed on the verge of dying. It was a gloomy, oppressive place, but the rent was cheap, and I was broke. I lived on the 2nd floor. Right across the hall from me lived Mr. Abernathy, a quiet man in his late 70s. One sweltering July, a strange smell began to creep into the hallway. At first, it was faint, like a bag of garbage that had been left out a day too long. But as the days passed, it ripened into something thick, sweet, and unbelievably foul. It clung to the back of your throat. A heavy cloud of black flies began to gather around the edges of Mr. Abernathy's doorframe. I called the landlord, who called the police. I stood shivering in the hallway despite the summer heat as 2 officers forced the heavy wooden door open. The stench that rolled out was like a physical blow. Mr. Abernathy had passed away in his armchair in the middle of a heat wave. He had been sitting there alone for over 3 weeks. The image of them bringing out that heavy, dark body bag burned itself into my mind. The landlord did a quick, cheap cleaning of the apartment, but the stain of death, both literal and figurative, never really left. The hallway always felt a little colder after that, a little darker. 2 months later, the landlord rented the unit out to a young college student named Mark. He was a bright-eyed, cheerful kid, seemingly unbothered by the apartment's dark history. But that didn't last long. Within a month, the bags under Mark's eyes were so dark they looked like bruises. He lost weight. He jumped at shadows. One evening, I ran into him checking his mail. He looked terrified. "Do you hear it?" he whispered to me, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his keys. At night, the scratching in the walls and the whispering, like someone is standing right on the other side of the plaster, just chuckling. I tried to comfort him, telling him it was just the old pipes, mice, or the building settling. He just shook his head, staring through me. "She never stops smiling," he muttered under his breath as he walked away. I had no idea what he meant. A week later, I woke up to find Mark's front door wide open. I cautiously peeked it inside. His wallet was on the counter. His phone was plugged into the charger. A bowl of cereal sat on the table, the milk completely spoiled. All of his clothes, his laptop, his car keys, everything was still there, but Mark was gone. The police investigated, but they found absolutely nothing. No signs of a struggle, no footage of him leaving the building. It was as if the apartment had simply opened its jaws and swallowed him whole. That was the breaking point for me. The oppressive gloom of the building, the death, the disappearance. It was suffocating. I packed my things and broke my lease. I needed light. I needed safety. I found a beautiful, modern duplex on the other side of town. It was everything. The old apartment wasn't bright, airy, with large windows, pristine white walls, and sturdy floors that didn't make a sound. When I moved in, I felt an immediate, overwhelming sense of relief. It felt like stepping out of a suffocating, muddy swamp and taking a deep breath of crisp, clean mountain air. For the first few weeks, I slept like a baby. I thought I had left the darkness behind. I thought I was safe, but horror, you see, doesn't always stay tied to a place. Sometimes it attaches itself to a person. Sometimes it follows you home. It happened on a Tuesday night. It was late, probably around 2:30 a.m. The house was dead silent, save for the gentle, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning. I woke up with a dry throat and a sudden, gnawing craving for a glass of cold milk and a snack. Wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, I padded barefoot out of my bedroom and headed downstairs. I didn't bother turning on the lights. The moonlight spilling through the large living room windows provided enough illumination to see by casting long, silvery rectangles across the hardwood floor. The house felt peaceful. To get to the kitchen, I had to walk through the dining area. My kitchen was semi-open, separated from the dining room by a wall with a wide doorway. Next to the refrigerator was a heavy wooden door that led to a walk-in pantry. I always kept it closed. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen, a sudden, inexplicable chill washed over me. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my stomach dropped like a stone. It was that ancient, evolutionary warning system firing off in my brain. You are being hunted. You are not alone. I froze, standing near the kitchen island, clutching my blanket. The kitchen was bathed in shadows. My eyes darted around the room. Stove, sink, counters, refrigerator, everything was in its place. But then, my gaze fell upon the pantry door. It was open. Just a crack, maybe 3 or 4 inches. I stared at that dark, vertical slit, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I know I shut that door. I thought I always shut that door. I took a hesitant step forward, reaching out to flip the light switch on the wall. That was when something moved in the darkness behind the door. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a face peeked out from the gap. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a wave of icy terror paralyze my limbs. It was the face of a woman, but her skin was the color of chalk, that sickening, unnatural dead white that seemed to catch the faint moonlight. Her hair was sparse, dark, and plastered to her forehead. But it was her features that shattered my sanity. Her eyes were completely round, bulging outward, lacking any eyelids. They were pitch black, staring directly into mine with a manic, unblinking intensity. And her mouth, dear God, her mouth. It was stretched into a wide, grotesque ear-to-ear grin. It was a smile so unnaturally wide that the skin of her cheeks looked like it was tearing at the seams. It was a predatory, mangled expression, exposing row upon row of small, yellowed teeth. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a rictus of pure, malicious anticipation. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just stared at me, her head tilted at a broken 90-degree angle, grinning that impossible grin from the darkness of my pantry. She never stopped smiling. Mark's final words echoed in my mind like a death knell. 4 of us moved. What felt an eternity. Stalemate. We were locked in a terrifying stalemate. My brain screamed at my legs to run, but they were rooted to the floor. The entity behind the door slowly, deliberately began to push the door open a fraction of an inch wider, revealing a long, spindly, bone-white hand gripping the edge of the wood. That small movement snapped the paralysis. Adrenaline flooded my veins. I didn't scream. My throat was too tight. I simply spun around and ran faster than I ever have in my life. I scrambled up the stairs on all 4s, scrambling frantically, terrified that at any second I would feel those cold, spindly fingers wrap around my ankle. I burst into my bedroom, slammed the door, threw the deadbolt, and shoved my heavy oak dresser against it. I huddled in the corner of my room, clutching my phone, sobbing silently as I dialed 911. The police arrived 10 minutes later with their sirens blaring. I threw my keys down to them from the 2nd-story window. They searched the entire house, top to bottom. They checked the kitchen, the pantry, the closets, and the basement. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No chalk-white woman. The pantry door was shut tight. The officer told me it was likely a night terror, a hallucination brought on by stress and waking up abruptly. I nodded, thanked them, and waited for them to leave. But I knew the truth. I knew what I saw. I knew that the entity from the rotting apartment had followed me. It had fed on Mr. Abernathy. It had taken Mark. And now it had found my new home. I moved out the very next morning. I left most of my furniture behind. It's been years since that night. I live in a different state now, in an apartment on a high floor. I've gone to therapy, tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the moonlight and a stressed mind. But no amount of therapy can erase a memory that vivid. To this day, I cannot sleep with a door even slightly ajar. I cannot walk into a dark kitchen at night, because every time I look at the dark crack of an open door, I don't see an empty room. I see those unblinking, bulging eyes, and I see that wide, white, impossible smile waiting for me in the dark. Sarah heard her boyfriend call her name from downstairs. The pitch, the inflection, the casual tone. It was perfectly him. The problem was, she had just watched his car pull out of the driveway 10 minutes earlier. She froze at the top of the staircase, the laundry basket slipping slightly in her grip. Her heart hammered against her ribs, echoing in her ears. She was 5 months pregnant, already exhausted, and currently standing in the oppressive silence of a sprawling, creaky house built in the 1920s. "Babe?" she called back, her voice trembling. Praying he had simply forgotten his wallet and walked back inside. There was no answer, but the house wasn't completely silent. As she stared down into the dim hallway below, she noticed it for the first time. The signature of the thing that had invaded her home. It started as a low, vibrating hum, like the white noise of a dead radio channel, making the air feel incredibly heavy. It was a sound that made her teeth ache. Then, stretching across the hardwood floor of the entryway, a shadow poured out from the kitchen. It was vaguely humanoid, but completely wrong. The proportions were unnerving. The limbs were stretched and elongated, and it stood far too tall to be human. It didn't move. It just stood there, projecting that suffocating, static hum. Sarah blinked, rubbing her eyes in disbelief. In a fraction of a second, the static snapped off. and the twisted shadow dissolved into the regular darkness of the room. She immediately dropped the laundry, locked herself in the master bedroom, and called his cell phone. He answered on the second ring. He was 3 miles away at the hardware store, whatever had been standing at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly wearing his voice. It wasn't him. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, the entity didn't leave. It studied them. It learned. The house transformed from a home into a hunting ground, and the entity revealed itself to be a mimic, a predator that weaponized familiarity. The static hum became their warning sign. Sometimes it would happen when Sarah was alone. She would feel that oppressive, electrical buzz in the air, followed by the sound of her own mother humming a lullaby from the empty dining room. The audio clipping and distorting just slightly. At the end of the notes, like a corrupted digital file. But the mimic was getting bolder. It was tired of just echoing. It wanted to manufacture pure terror. One evening, Sarah's boyfriend was sitting in the downstairs living room, the television murmuring quietly. Sarah had gone upstairs to draw a warm bath to soothe her aching joints. The water was running, the bathroom doors shut, and she was peacefully soaking in the tub, her eyes closed. Downstairs, the television was suddenly drowned out by a sound that made her boyfriend's blood run cold. It was a scream. It wasn't a yelp of surprise. It was a terrifying, blood-curdling shriek of pure agony. And it was Sarah's voice. It sounded like she was being violently torn apart in the upstairs bathroom. Panic exploded in his chest. He dropped the remote, leaped over the coffee table, and sprinted up the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. As he reached the second-floor landing, he felt it. A heavy, vibrating, static hum buzzing through the floorboards, making the hairs on his arms stand up. He slammed his shoulder into the bathroom door. Bursting into the room, heart pounding out of his chest, ready to kill whatever intruder had gotten inside. He stopped dead in his tracks. Sarah was sitting in the bathtub, covered in bubbles, looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. She hadn't made a single sound. "What's wrong? What happened?" she cried, reacting to his panicked entrance. "You were just screaming," he panted, gripping the doorframe, his hands shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed through his system. "I heard you screaming like you were dying." "I haven't made a sound," she whispered. They stared at each other in the humid bathroom. The horrifying realization washing over them. The mimic wasn't just playing tricks anymore. It was actively trying to break them psychologically. But the absolute peak of the nightmare didn't happen until after the baby was born. Bringing a newborn home is a chaotic blur of sleep deprivation and constant anxiety. You become hyper-vigilant to every little noise. Sarah and her boyfriend had set up a state-of-the-art baby monitor in the nursery, complete with a night vision video feed and a highly sensitive microphone. It was around 3 a.m. Both parents were completely exhausted, finally drifting into a desperately needed sleep in their bedroom. Down the hall, suddenly, a sound ripped through the quiet night, freezing the blood in their veins. It was their baby screaming, but it wasn't a normal, fussy infant cry. It was a desperate, ear-piercing wail of absolute, primal terror. And worst of all, it sounded like it was coming from right outside their bedroom door. Both parents jolted awake in a fraction of a second. Motherly instinct took over, and Sarah scrambled to the edge of the bed, ready to sprint into the hall. But her boyfriend grabbed her arm in a vice grip and pointed a shaking finger at the nightstand. The baby monitor. The screen was glowing brightly in the dark room. On the video feed, their infant was fast asleep, his little chest rising and falling peacefully in the crib. But the most terrifying part was the audio meter. The digital green bar was completely flat, dead silent. The microphone wasn't picking up a single sound from the nursery, yet out in the hallway, the horrific, echoing wails of their screaming infant continued to ring out through the dark house. Sarah looked at the bottom edge of their closed bedroom door. The hallway nightlight was suddenly blotted out. A massive elongated shadow was blocking the light from the other side, and the doorknob began to vibrate with that sickening, low-frequency static hum. The mimic was putting on a show, using their most primal parental fears against them, trying to lure them out into the dark. They huddled together on the bed, holding their breath, terrified to move until the crying finally, slowly glitched out and faded away into nothing. Years went by. The immense, constant stress of the haunting, combined with the struggles of normal life, eventually destroyed the relationship. You can't live in a house where you can't trust your own ears. Sarah and her boyfriend separated, seeking a desperately needed fresh start. Sarah packed up her life and moved out of that accursed 1920s house. She and her young son moved in with her own mother, a new environment, a safe place. For a long time there was peace. The static hum was gone. Sarah finally began to sleep through the night without keeping one ear open for phantom voices. She thought she had left the nightmare behind in the walls of that old English home. She was wrong. Just a few weeks ago, the haunting returned. But this time, the rules had changed. It was the dead of night. The house was pitch black and completely silent. Her mother and her son were fast asleep in their rooms. Sarah was lying in bed, hovering in that strange space between being awake and asleep. Suddenly, from the darkness of her bedroom corner, the air pressure dropped. Her teeth began to ache. The static hum was back. Then a voice spoke. It didn't sound like her ex-boyfriend. It didn't sound like her mother. It was a man's voice. Incredibly deep, gravelly, and entirely unfamiliar, laced with heavy, distorted breathing. It carried a sinister weight that made the temperature in the room plummet. Sarah, it dragged out, the audio glitching and popping, the syllables dripping with a mocking familiarity. Before she could even gasp for air, the sound of massive, heavy footsteps erupted from the entryway of the house. Thud. 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 It sounded like a massive man wearing heavy work boots was sprinting frantically back and forth across the hardwood floors, pacing in the dark. Right outside the bedrooms, the footsteps were far too heavy to be human. She pulled the covers over her head, trembling, clutching her phone, praying for the morning sun to rise. The mimic wasn't attached to the house. It was attached to her. It had watched her, learned her fears, and simply waited in the shadows all these years before deciding to introduce itself again. The footsteps eventually stopped. The static faded. But Sarah didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly through the kitchen windows. Sarah stood at the counter, exhausted, staring blankly at her coffee mug. wondering if she was losing her mind. She was debating if it was finally time to call a priest or an exorcist, terrified of angering something that knew exactly how to manipulate her. Her train of thought was broken by the sound of small feet pattering into the kitchen. Her young son walked in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. He looked up at her, tilting his head with innocent confusion.
"Mom?"
he asked, his voice small and groggy. "Yes, sweetie, what's wrong?" Sarah replied, trying to force a reassuring smile. Her son frowned. "Why were you standing outside my closet, calling my name in the dark last night?" Sarah's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering into pieces on the floor. She hadn't left her bed once,